Now we meet a family friend to millions, better known as Herbie to the children, but undoubtedly one of the 20th century's design classics.
Volkswagen once claimed that their car was, with the Coke bottle, the most famous mass-produced shape in the world. And certainly no car has ever made such a place for itself in popular affections.
We found a wonderful bargain, a little Beetle Volkswagen.
This is Stoner Park, Berkshire, the site of one of many VW Club rallies, where devotees come to participate in the mysterious rituals of a cult.
Is it a 1200?
It's 1800.
18? Look at this engine, Anna. It's as good as the bodywork. Look. Fantastic.
The Beetle isn't just a car. More even than its rivals, the Citroën 2CV or the Mini, it's the classic of automotive design.
I think the Beetle has qualities in common with other objects that I'd call classics. And I'd describe it by saying that they have nothing about them that's extra to their function, that they work as basic machines and therefore allow you to interpret them and read things into them as you will.
For non-believers, the Beetle is ugly, noisy, uncomfortable, difficult to drive and difficult to service. It has stuck to its basic, inelegant lines in an industry which has been as prone to changes of shape and style as the fashion industry. Nonetheless, over 20 million of them have been produced.
The thing about the VW is it didn't look like the latest thing very much, even when it first came out. No, I think the classicism of it is part nostalgia in a funny way, of they don't make cars like that anymore, and part harking back to an era of kind of solidity when, you know, cars were made in pieces and therefore, you know, you can customize them and do all sorts of things with them rather than coming out of a mold. And people feel that maybe middle-range cars all look the same these days. You often hear that and so on. So I think it's much more to do with the longevity than it is to do with the aesthetics of it that has made it a design classic. Up until the 30s, everyone had associated the small car with boxes, with the Model T and spin-offs. And to go from the box to the round, I mean, this is a good Bauhaus principle, from cubes to circles, is a basic geometric progression. So there's a huge distinction between everything that had preceded it. And there haven't been many round cars. I mean, you know, bubble cars came and went, rounded cars of other sorts have come and gone. On the whole, the box, or the cube, remains the basic geometric shape of popular small cars. So I think it's that distinctiveness, which one could even paradoxically argue on Bauhaus principles, that makes it a classic, rather than its kind of timeless beauty. Because I don't think anyone would say, even the fondest supporter of the VW would say that this thing has a timeless beauty about it.
The folk for whom the car was originally designed were the German people, and the Wagen, or car, was to be one of many benefits that Adolf Hitler was going to confer on them in his new Germany of the 1930s, along with full employment, autobahns, and, as it turned out, much else. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche had been working on a prototype people's car for the NSU Motorcycle Company since 1932. NSU couldn't afford the project, and Hitler commissioned Dr. Porsche to develop his revolutionary prototype into a commercial proposition, using his notably original specifications. A rear-mounted, flat-4 horizontally opposed engine, cooled by air, not water, independent all-round suspension, and an aerodynamically designed body which would give a top speed of 100 kilometers an hour. In 1937, Daimler-Benz built 30 prototypes, which were called VW30s. The development was teutonically thorough. The road tests were over 150,000 kilometers under arduous conditions in the Black Forest and flat out on the new autobahns, where even Rolls-Royce advised their owners to take it easy. The car fitted into Nazi propaganda perfectly. It would create new jobs and cock a snook at the other industrial nations by using the very latest mass production techniques. The foundation stone of the factory was laid in 1938 at what is now called Wolfsburg, near Hanover. The factory too was a showcase. Workers would have the finest working conditions, clinics and sports facilities, although the machinery, ironically, had to be mainly imported from America. A 100 prototypes were produced to dazzle the world's press and bear witness to the engineering achievements of the Third Reich.
They used this car, when it was launched, as a linchpin of party propaganda. For all sorts of reasons. It showed how automated Germany had become. It showed how the rearmament program had all sorts of constructive domestic spin-offs. It showed that there was a modern image of the party, the Autobahn image. And I think this is part of the design history of the 1930s in Germany. Because it's a great myth, you know, that yes, the Nazis did close the Bauhaus. Yes, there was a lot of rhetoric about they didn't like modernism in design, they didn't like tubular steel furniture, they didn't like all that, they preferred craft, Black Forest, people sort of working with their hands and all the rest of it. But actually that is a myth, that's pure rhetoric. Now the VW is a fascinating example because obviously it comes out of the modernity side. And I found a cover of a motoring magazine which dates from 3 months after the very first launch of the Volkswagen in 1938, which actually epitomizes this, because what we've got is a VW going along one of the new autobahns, only it's not called a Volkswagen yet. It's called a KDF wagon, which means a strength through joy mobile. And it's written in that Nazi Gothic lettering, not in your modern Bauhaus lettering, not in the way that you'd expect to be related to a piece of automation like this. So they didn't think there was a contradiction there. You look in the back and you see plenty of headroom, which is a piece of fiction. One wonders if the artist had actually seen the prototype, but you've got these very Aryan, well-scrubbed looking kids in the back, looking ever so joyful and strong out of the window. And you've got the convertible going the other way, which of course didn't come onto the domestic market until the late 1950s, where they've got the back completely wrong to make it look like an upmarket Mercedes-Benz. In other words, you've got your iconography of Nazism with your swastikas and your fair faces, but you've got this modernity superimposed on it, and it's symbolized, I think, by the rising sun behind it, which is this Nazi symbol, and instead of the usual cluster of oak leaves or eagles, all the things that Albert Speer was responsible for, you've got a cogwheel around it. This was the symbol of the four-year plan, 1936 to 1940.
The cost of the car that everybody was going to be able to afford was kept artificially low, about the same as an average motorcycle. The KDF organisation started a savings scheme, and 336,000 Volk bought savings stamps, even though no delivery date was ever promised. Wisely, as it happened, the cars were never delivered. The factory was already turning over its production lines to other forms of mechanised transport. By the outbreak of war, the VW chassis was being used for amphibious and reconnaissance military vehicles, seen as a more pressing priority than a people's car. Later in the war, the Luftwaffe took over the factory to construct and repair airframes. By the end of the war, 2/3 of the factory had been destroyed by Allied bombing. But in occupied Germany, there was a desperate need for transport and spare parts. The British military government sent Major Ivan Hurst to Wolfsburg to take a look.
I was sent to the factory in August as a military government man to take charge of the place and to see if production could be started. The factory was pretty well in ruins, having been heavily bombed towards the end of the war by the United States Air Force. But happily, most of the machine tools were still there. They'd been moved into the cellars in anticipation of air attack and to dispersal sites in the countryside around. And the big presses were, by and large, still intact, or at least repairable.
And so, a little later than envisaged, Hitler's People's Car went into production. The first cars were made from components dug out of the rubble. Later, the British Army helpfully provided the raw materials. The first limited run of VWs was reserved for the occupying forces and such official bodies as the Post Office. Other than that, the factory's main function was to keep all surviving transport running. But by 1947, the political climate was changing. The Allies realized that they needed a strong German economy. German companies were encouraged to export their products to help pay their way. VWs began to appear in German showrooms. A few were sold abroad. The British military administration began to look for commercial backers for the car. Lord Rootes came over to have a look, but wasn't impressed. An American committee that reported to Henry Ford II said it wasn't worth a damn.
By the time the imports began proper, the bugs had been got out of the original design. There were bugs. It was largely the British and the American users in the first 2 years who had reported back, and the Germans and ourselves had sorted out the defects. For one thing, smell. The early cars, due to shortage of materials, used fish glue in the trim, and when it rained, the car stank of fish. The oil coolers were soldered up using an inferior solder, and they cracked under vibration and let the smell of hot oil into the car. The brakes were almost non-existent when they needed adjusting. They were just badly designed. A lot of people couldn't get on with a crash gearbox. The synchromesh gearboxes were coming along. But on the other side of the medal, the Volkswagen was there at a fairly reasonable price. It was economical. It was rugged. It had, I think, reliability. And also they did develop a very good service, after-sales service, largely on our orders in the beginning.